is video 3 of the Constitution and Nation Building. This is basically the Constitution continued. So when we left off with the Virginia and New Jersey plans, right? Which one? The big states wanted representation to be based on population, while the small states like New Jersey wanted it to be all states to have an equal number of votes. So what happens is this, the Great Compromise, right? The Great Compromise provides kind of a middle ground for agreement because they decide on a bicameral legislature that had one house based on population and one representing all states equally. So they basically incorporate both plans together. It's the Great Compromise. So this bicameral, when you see this word right here, bicameral, it just means two-chambered legislature. So each state is given 2 representatives in the Senate, which is the upper chamber. So if you don't know about the legislative branch, this is what I'm talking about, right? The upper chamber is the Senate. You get 2 representatives, 2 senators, right, per state. And then population determines the number of representatives in the lower chamber or the House of Representatives, okay? So there's a lot more than just 2. So elements of both plans are adopted. Well, what happens when we talk about in that lower chamber when it comes to representatives in the South, right? Now, the delegates from the southern states want to count slaves for the purposes of representation, right? Because, well, as we saw before, there's a lot of slaves, right? So, in some states, African Americans are in the majority. So, of course, they're going to want to count them, even though these southern delegates don't believe these African American slaves to be human or, citizens. They are property, but they still want them to at least count to have more people in this lower chamber. But they only succeed in this. They get this, a compromise on free state and slave state interests by agreeing to count 5 slaves as 3 freemen, what's known as the 3/5 compromise. So each slave counts as 3/5 of a person, basically. So they somewhat get some more representation there. Now, the Constitution never specifically mentions the word slave or slavery in it. It refers to human property as other persons. And really, these founding fathers just hoped that slavery might go away. They didn't at this time really want to discuss too much of it. So there's a couple key concepts of the Constitution we need to go over. The first is the separation of powers into the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches of the federal government. So if you don't know much about the Constitution, know this. There's 3 branches, right? These are the 3 branches. So let's go over each of them. The executive branch is headed by the president, which would be Obama right now, as in 2013. So it's headed by the president, the executive branch, and the president carries out federal laws, recommends new ones, directs national defense, foreign policy, performs ceremonial duties. He has a lot of powers. He directs the government. He commands the armed forces. He deals with international powers. He's the chief law enforcement officer. He gets to veto laws. He's got a lot on his plate. Now, with the legislative branch, that's kind of what we've been talking about, right? With that bicameral Senate and House of Representatives. So this is Congress, basically. And the main task of the 2 bodies of Congress, the Senate and House of Representatives, is to make the laws of the country. So its powers include passing laws, making spending bills, impeaching officials, approving treaties, these types of things. Now, that last branch of government is the judicial branch, and this is headed by the Supreme Court. We'll get to the Supreme Court later on in this section. But its powers include interpreting the Constitution, reviewing laws, and deciding cases involving state rights. So those are the 3 branches of this government. Now, another key concept of the Constitution is a system of checks and balances. So the first one is a separation of power, so one's not above the other. A system of checks and balances is the other concept. And this is so that each branch can basically keep in check the other branches, right? Such as the presidential veto, where the president, if it doesn't like a law, can veto it. They're intended to help prevent tyranny from arising and to force deliberation and compromise. This is what the original founding fathers at least claimed that the system of checks and balances would accomplish. There's a lot of historians like Howard Zinn, Charles Beard, who Zinn discusses Charles Beard, who published an economic interpretation of the Constitution in 1913. These historians argue that the founding fathers basically were a group of economic elitists that were primarily interested in protecting and advancing their own interests. So this system of checks and balances, they say, for instance, is not intended to block tyranny in this new government, but a plot to prevent majority rule. So there's lots of different sides to these things. It's not just what's written down here. So make sure you read Howard Zinn to understand a lot of these different arguments. But just because these delegates have come together and decided to scrap the Articles of Confederation and build a whole new government doesn't mean that all of a sudden they're going to vote on it and it's going to be the law of the land. It needs to be ratified. So basically on September 17th, 1787, the 39 delegates that are still in attendance, they signed the Constitution and announced that they only need the approval of 9 states. So only 9 need to go ahead and okay it, which is another kind of like ratifying it means that you are going to adopt it, right? So it takes 2 years to deliberate between these states and adopt the Constitution. So this is known as the ratification period, these 2 years between 1787 and basically 1789. So there are 2 different sides, right? There are the Federalists who support the Constitution. They want it to be ratified. They want it to be passed. And they support the stronger central government, also known as nationalists. And then the other side are, easy to remember, they're just called the anti-federalists. They believe the Constitution gives way too much power to the central government. They said it's going to weaken the autonomy of local communities and states. Basically, states' rights are going to be thrown out the window. So these are the 2 people that are debating this during the ratification period. And there is a series of papers that comes out that are published in the New York newspapers that are labeled the Federalist Papers. It's a series of essays that are authored by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, who will become very much important in the Supreme Court later on. And these basically remain the most concise explanation behind the intent of the Constitution. So it basically explains what the Constitution is and why it is. And so these are why the Federalist Papers are very important. And they're also, an excerpt from the Federalist Papers is document 7 in chapter 5 of Major Problems this week. So if you're wondering what the heck Federalist Papers are, as you go to read that document, this is where it's from. Sure enough, all the debate ends on June 21st, 1788, when the Constitution is ratified by the required 9 states. New Hampshire becomes the 9th state to ratify. It's not the law of the land, but basically all 13 states will ratify by 1789. And by March 4th, 1789, the first Congress of the United States of America is seated. So March 4th, 1789, the first Congress is seated, and now we have a whole new form of government. So now what I want you to do is go on to the YouTube clip, another crash course of U.S. history, number 8. I hope you guys like these crash course on U.S. history. I think that's a lot jam-packed into these short videos, but it's a lot of good information. And it's labeled the Constitution, the Articles, and Federalism. And then go on to the last video of the section, video 4, the Bill of Rights, the Judiciary, and George Washington.